The first sound was the shattering of glass. Not the boisterous crash of a saloon brawl, but a sharp, deliberate crack that sliced through the morning calm of Bitter Creek. Samuel Croft, the teller at the Bitter Creek Savings and Loan, looked up from his ledger, his spectacles sliding down his nose. Through the newly fractured pane of the front window, he saw 3 riders. They were not dusty cowboys or weary prospectors. They moved with the cold purpose of wolves, their faces obscured by dark bandanas. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Samuel's throat. He fumbled for the alarm bell beneath his counter, but before his trembling fingers could reach it, the batwing doors burst inward. The leader, a tall man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, leveled a Colt Peacemaker. His eyes, visible above the bandana, were the color of a frozen lake. Not a sound, the man's voice was a low growl, devoid of emotion. Anyone moves, anyone makes a sound, and Mr. Croft here will be the first to meet his maker. The few customers in the bank froze. Mrs. Gable, there to deposit her husband's meager earnings, clutched her reticule to her chest, her face ashen. Old man Hemlock, half-deaf and slow to understand, simply stared, his mouth agape. 2 of the robbers moved with practiced efficiency, one covering the customers, while the other vaulted the counter and forced Samuel toward the vault. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of fear and gun oil. "Open it," the robber commanded, pressing the barrel of his revolver into the soft flesh behind Samuel's ear. Samuel's hands shook so violently he could barely work the combination. His mind raced not with thoughts of the town's money, but of his wife Martha waiting for him at home with a pot of coffee. He'd promised to be home for lunch. The tumblers clicked into place one by one, each sound an eternity. The heavy steel doors swung inward, revealing stacks of currency and bags of coin. The leader stepped past him, his gaze sweeping over the wealth with disdain. "Forget the cash." Samuel stared bewildered. What kind of bank robber ignored the money? The leader pointed to the wall of safe deposit boxes. "Number 17, open it." I can't," Samuel stammered. "It requires 2 keys, the bank's and the owner's." The leader's cold eyes narrowed. Without a word, he turned and fired a single shot into the floorboards next to Mrs. Gable's feet. She screamed a raw, piercing sound that was choked off by a sob. "I won't ask again," the leader said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Terror gave Samuel's hands a desperate strength. He grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from the corner of the vault. The lock on box 17 was sturdy, but the robber's impatience was stronger. He shoved Samuel aside, took the bar, and with a grunt of effort wrenched the small metal door from its hinges. He reached inside his gloved hand, bypassing a small stack of legal documents and a velvet pouch that likely held jewelry. He pulled out a single item, a silver locket tarnished with age, hanging from a delicate chain. The front was engraved with a compass rose, its points intricate and finely detailed. He glanced at it for a moment, an unreadable emotion flickering in his eyes, then tucked it securely into his coat pocket. "We're done," he called to his men. They backed out of the bank as methodically as they had entered, their guns never wavering. Within moments, they were on their horses and gone, leaving behind a shattered window, a splintered floorboard, and a town paralyzed by a crime that made no sense. Samuel Croft, his body still trembling, slumped against the vault door, the scent of gunpowder stinging his nostrils. They hadn't taken a single dollar. They had come for a memory. Owen Blackthorne arrived in Bitter Creek 3 hours later, the bay mare he'd been training, trotting calmly behind his sturdy gelding. The sun was high, casting long shadows from the mesas that guarded the valley. Red sand glowed like embers under the unforgiving sun, and the wind whispered through skeletal sagebrush. The town was abuzz, small knots of anxious people gathered on the street, their voices a low murmur of fear and confusion. Sheriff Roy Murdoch met him near the livery stable, his weary face etched with more lines than usual. "Owen, glad you're here," Murdoch said, his tone grim. "There's been trouble." "I can see that," Owen replied, his deep voice a quiet rumble. His gaze swept over the townsfolk, noting their unease. "Outlaws?" "Viper Kane's crew, we think. Hit the bank this morning." Murdoch hesitated. It was strange. They didn't take any money. A cold dread began to seep into Owen's bones. What did they take? They broke into the safe deposit boxes. Only one of them. Number 17. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Number 17 was his. It was Catherine's. He had rented it years ago to store the deed to their land and the few precious things his late wife had left behind. He dismounted, his movements stiff, and walked toward the bank, the sheriff falling into step beside him. The interior of the bank was a scene of controlled chaos. Murdoch's young deputy Pete was taking statements, his pencil scratching nervously across his notepad. Samuel Croft sat in a chair, a cup of coffee shaking in his hand, his eyes wide and distant. He looked up as Owen's massive frame filled the doorway, a flicker of recognition and pity in his gaze. Owen walked to the vault. The pried-open door of box 17 hung like a broken jaw. Inside, the empty velvet-lined box lay on its side. He reached in and picked it up, his immense scarred hands that could tame a wild mustang, with a touch as light as a feather, cradling the small container with impossible gentleness. The world outside faded away. He was standing not in a violated bank, but in a field of wildflowers under a summer sky 15 years in the past. Catherine's laughter, bright and clear, echoed in his memory. He saw himself opening this very box, revealing the silver locket nestled on the velvet. A compass rose, she had said, her fingers tracing the engraving. "So you'll always find your way back to me." "I'll never need a compass for that," he had replied, his voice thick with an emotion he was only just learning to name. "You're my true North, Catherine." The memory was so vivid, so painful. It was a physical blow. He squeezed his eyes shut, the empty box a crushing weight in his hand. This was no random robbery. This was a message. Viper Kane, a ghost from a past he had fought for 12 years to keep buried, had not just declared war. He had desecrated a memory. He had stolen Owen's North Star, leaving him adrift in a sea of grief and rising fury. The question was not just how Kane had found him, but why he would commit such a deliberately cruel and personal act. Why steal a locket of little monetary value? The answer, Owen knew, lay buried in the same grave as the man he used to be. And he feared he would have to dig them both up to get it back. For 12 years, Owen Blackthorne had been a man of quiet routine. He rose before the sun, his massive frame moving silently through the small house he'd built with his own hands. The scent of brewing coffee and wood smoke was the smell of peace. His life was measured in the steady progress of the horses he trained and the equally steady growth of his daughter Bethany Rose. At 12 years old, Bethany was a perfect fusion of her parents, Catherine's fiery auburn curls and her father's steady, deep green eyes. She possessed a wisdom beyond her years, a quiet strength that had been forged in the crucible of growing up without a mother. "Papa, you're staring at that box again," she said from the doorway of the kitchen. She held a plate of freshly baked biscuits, her expression a mixture of concern and practiced patience. Owen started pulling himself from the memory of the bank. It had been 2 days since the robbery, 2 days of a cold, gnawing anxiety that had settled deep in his gut. The empty velvet box now sat on the mantelpiece, a stark reminder of the violation. "Just thinking, little bird," he said, his voice gruff with unspoken emotion. "You think about Mama a lot," she stated, not as a question. She set the plate on the rough-hewn table. "You think the men who took her locket knew it was hers?" The question was sharp, perceptive. Owen looked at his daughter, at the intelligent light in her eyes, and knew he couldn't shield her from the world's harshness forever. "I think they did." He had spent his life cultivating stillness, believing that if he moved quietly enough, the violence of his past would not notice him. He spoke more to horses than to people, his words sparse and deliberate. Folks in Bitter Creek called him a gentle giant, marveling at the contrast between his sheer size — he stood a hand taller than any other man in town — and the quiet patience he showed his animals and his child. They saw the man who read stories to Bethany every night by the fire, his deep voice a soothing rumble. They did not see the coiled tension in his shoulders or the ghosts that flickered in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. He had built this life as a fortress, the house with its sturdy walls and welcoming porch, the corral where trust was earned, not broken. The quiet evenings spent with Bethany on the wooden swing, watching the sun bleed across the western sky, painting the mesas in shades of purple and orange. This was his sanctuary. That afternoon, his old friend Tobias Fletcher rode in from his ranch 30 miles south. Tobias was a wiry man, his face a roadmap of sun and wind, but his eyes were as sharp as they had been 2 decades ago when they'd ridden together. He dismounted without preamble, his gaze falling on the empty box on the mantel. "I heard the news in Silverton," Tobias said, his voice low. "Came as fast as I could. They said the robbers didn't take a cent." "They took something more valuable," Owen said. Tobias nodded, his expression grim. "Owen, word is, it's Viper Kane. If he's in this territory, and he knows you're here." He let the sentence hang in the air, heavy with unspoken history. "He has no reason to know anything about me." Owen cut him off, his tone sharper than intended. "I'm a horse trainer, Tobias, that's all." "Some men have long memories," Tobias countered softly. "And Kane isn't the forgiving type. If you need anything at all, you know where to find me." After his friend left, Owen stood alone in his corral, the scent of horse and hay a familiar comfort. But the peace felt fragile now, like a thin sheet of ice over deep, cold water. The robbery wasn't a random act. It was a prelude, a declaration. Kane was circling, testing the defenses of the life Owen had so carefully constructed. The theft of the locket was a key designed to unlock a door Owen had bolted shut 12 years ago. A door that led back to a man they called the Phantom. He was working with a spirited stallion, a magnificent black creature named Thunder, when Bethany returned from school. She ran up the path, her satchel bouncing on her back, her face alight with the simple joy of a day well spent. "Papa, Miss Porter said my essay on the geography of the territory was the best in the class." Owen turned, the hard lines of his face softening instantly at the sight of her. "That's because you see the world with your mother's eyes, little bird. She always found the beauty in the rocks and the dust." They spent the rest of the afternoon in their familiar routine. He finished with the horses while she tended her small garden of herbs. They ate dinner at the kitchen table, the two of them a small island of warmth against the encroaching twilight. But as darkness fell, the anxiety returned sharper this time. He found himself checking the locks on the doors, his gaze scanning the dark line of the hills. Later, after Bethany was asleep, he sat on the porch. The night was quiet, the only sounds the chirp of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. The wooden swing beside him moved gently in the breeze, its soft creak a lonely counterpoint to the silence. He thought of Kane, of the cold, dead eyes he remembered from a bloody cattle war in Texas. Kane had been working for the other side, a man who took pleasure in cruelty. Their final confrontation had left Cain wounded and Owen spiritually broken after a child was killed in the crossfire. That day the Phantom had died and Owen Blackthorne had been born. He had walked away seeking a life where his hands would be used to heal, not to harm. He had believed that life was his. He had been wrong. The robbery was Cain's opening move. Now Owen could only wait for the next one, a helpless feeling that chafed at him like a poorly fitted saddle. He was a man of action trapped in a waiting game, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the stakes were about to become terrifyingly high. The silence was the first thing that struck him. Not the peaceful quiet of early morning, but a dead, unnatural stillness. He had risen before dawn, a habit ingrained from his former life, and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold, the stars brilliant in the pre-dawn sky. But something was wrong. The swing, Bethany's swing, was motionless. A half-eaten apple sat on the porch railing, a book lay open on the floor beside her favorite chair. She had been here just hours ago, a cold dread far sharper than the one he'd felt after the robbery clawed at his throat. Bethany, he called, his voice a harsh whisper in the silent air. He pushed open the door to her room. The bed was empty, the covers thrown back. Her school clothes for the day were laid out on a chair. She hadn't run away. He moved through the house, a roaring in his ears. The kitchen was tidy, the back door locked. He returned to the front room, his eyes scanning every detail, his mind refusing to accept the impossible. Then he saw it. A single white envelope propped against the empty velvet box on the mantelpiece. His blood turned to ice. It hadn't been there when he went to bed. With trembling hands, he picked it up. His name, Blackthorne, was scrawled across the front. Inside a single sheet of paper held a crudely written message. Blackthorne. We have your girl. The locket was just to get your attention. Now we have something you can't replace. $10,000 in gold if you want to see her alive. You have 3 days. Come alone to the Devil's Backbone at sunset on the 3rd day. No law, no tricks, or you'll get her back in pieces. You know who this is. Go. The paper slipped from his numb fingers. The roaring in his ears intensified. The carefully constructed fortress of his life had been breached. The swing on the front porch, which had always been a symbol of peace and paternal love, now seemed to mock him, its emptiness a screaming void in the center of his world. Cain hadn't just taken his daughter. He had taken his reason for being. The gentle giant was gone, the peace he had cultivated for 12 years shattered in an instant. In his place, something old and cold and dangerous began to stir. The Phantom, buried but never truly dead, was waking up. Owen didn't ride to town. He devoured the miles, his horse sensing the cold fury that radiated from its rider. He burst into Sheriff Murdoch's office like a dust devil, the ransom note clutched in his fist. He has her, Owen's voice was a low, dangerous growl. Cain has Bethany. Murdoch's weary face went pale as he read the note. He sank into his chair, the paper trembling in his hand. $10,000. Owen, that's an impossible sum. He doesn't expect you to pay it. I know, Owen said, his hands clenching and unclenching. This isn't about money. It's a death sentence. He's luring me into a trap. I'll raise a posse, Murdoch said, already reaching for his rifle. Every able-bodied man in Bitter Creek. No. The word was flat absolute. The note was clear. No law. If he sees a posse, he'll kill her before we're within a mile of them. Owen's gaze was fixed on the far mountains, his mind already a battlefield of strategy and desperation. This is my fight, Roy. He made it personal. This is my town, Owen. Bethany is one of my citizens, Murdoch countered, his sense of duty warring with the stark reality of the threat. Viper Kane is a wanted murderer. He and his gang are known for their cruelty. You can't face them alone. I have to, Owen said, his voice dropping. There's a history between us. He's counting on me being a simple horse trainer. He's counting wrong. Leaving the sheriff to wrestle with his conscience, Owen strode down the dusty street to the Silver Dollar Saloon. The morning light barely penetrated the gloom inside, where Maria Santos was wiping down the bar, her movements economical and precise. She looked up as Owen entered her dark, intelligent eyes, taking in his rigid posture and the storm in his expression. She poured a cup of black coffee without being asked and pushed it toward him. I heard the news, she said softly. News traveled on the wind in a town this small. I'm sorry, Owen. Maria, he began, his voice tight, you see everything in this town. Did you see anyone watching my place? Anyone who didn't belong? She paused her work, her gaze direct. Weeks ago. A few men came through. They asked questions. Quiet questions, but they asked. She leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. They were Kane's men. One of them was in here drinking. He talked too much. But their leader, he was different. He came in once, just for a moment. He didn't drink, he just watched. What did he look like? Maria's brow furrowed in thought. He was tall, but not like you. Lean. He moved like a dancer, not a brawler. And his hands. She looked down at her own. They were a gentleman's hands. Smooth, no calluses. Not the hands of a man who's done a day of hard labor in his life. The detail struck Owen as discordant. Outlaws lived rough. Their hands were tools of their trade, scarred and hardened. A gentleman's hands. It was the first clue, a piece of a puzzle he didn't yet understand. There was something else, Maria added. One of the men who was drinking, he mentioned they were waiting for the judge's word. I thought it was just whiskey talk. The judge. Another piece. It meant nothing to Owen now, but he filed it away. His focus had to be singular, Bethany. He left the saloon and walked to the edge of town, staring out at the jagged peaks of the Devil's Backbone. It was treacherous country, a maze of canyons, and abandoned mines, a place where a man could disappear forever. Kane had chosen his ground well. Owen knew he couldn't storm the hideout. He had to be smarter, quieter. He had to become a ghost again. As he stood there, the weight of his decision settled upon him. To save his daughter, he would have to resurrect the man he had sworn to leave behind. He would have to embrace the skills, the coldness, the lethal precision of the Phantom. And he prayed that when it was over, there would be enough of Owen Blackthorne left to be the father Bethany deserved. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the landscape in hues of blood and fire, two riders approached Owen's homestead. It was Tobias, and with him, a man Owen hadn't seen in over a decade, a former associate from his past life, known only as Silas, a tracker whose skills were legendary. I heard the news and made a call, Tobias said, gesturing to Silas. Thought you might need an extra set of eyes. Silas, a wiry man with eyes that missed nothing, nodded a curt greeting. Blackthorne. Been a long time. Tobias, I told you. I'm doing this alone. Owen set his jaw tight. No, you're not. Tobias, replied, his voice firm. Catherine would never forgive me if I let you ride into that canyon by yourself. We're not here to fight your battle, Owen. We're here to make sure you get the chance to fight it. Before Owen could argue further, his eyes caught a flicker of movement near the path leading from town. A flash of blue snagged on a sagebrush. He walked over, his heart pounding. It was a piece of Bethany's hair ribbon and the one she'd been wearing the day she was taken. Cain was taunting him, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs made of his daughter's innocence. The act was so cruel, so personal, it solidified Owen's resolve. The time for restraint was over. He accepted his friend's help. He couldn't afford pride when Bethany's life was at stake. The next morning, they set out not toward the Devil's Backbone, but on a wide, circuitous route. Owen's old instincts, long dormant, took over. He wasn't just a father. He was a hunter. He read the landscape, the broken twigs, the faint hoof prints in the hard-packed earth. Silas moved ahead, a silent wraith confirming the trail. As they rode, a lone rider approached from the direction of Bitter Creek. It was Deputy Pete, looking flustered. "Sheriff Murdoch sent me," he panted, reining in his horse. He got a telegram from a Judge Hayes in Colorado. Owen's head snapped up. Hayes. The same name Cain's man had mentioned in the saloon. "The judge is inquiring about fugitives in the area," Pete continued, reading from a slip of paper. "Wants to know if we've seen anyone matching the description of a man named the Phantom. He's offering his full cooperation with local law enforcement." A chill went down Owen's spine. It felt too convenient. A powerful judge from another territory offering unsolicited help at the exact moment Cain was making his move. It was another piece of the puzzle, one that hinted at a conspiracy far larger than a simple grudge. "Tell the sheriff, thank you," Owen said, his voice carefully neutral. "And tell him to be careful who he trusts." They continued their journey, the sense of urgency mounting. That evening, Silas found it an abandoned campsite, nestled in a small, hidden arroyo. The fire was cold, but not by more than a day. 8 men by the tracks. As Owen sifted through the refuse, his fingers closed around a small object half buried in the dirt. It was the stub of a cigar, not the cheap cheroots favored by cowboys, but an expensive hand-rolled cigar from the East. It was another discordant detail like the gentleman's hands. These were not common outlaws. Amen. They pressed on, pushing their horses through the night. The landscape grew more treacherous, the canyons deeper, the air thinner. They were in Cain's territory now. Every shadow could be an ambush, every gust of wind could carry a warning. Owen felt the change within himself. The quiet horse trainer was receding, replaced by a man of cold calculation. He thought not of what he would say to Cain, but of angles of attack, of weaknesses in a defensive perimeter, of the fastest way to neutralize a threat. He was becoming the Phantom again, and the transformation felt both necessary and terrifying. He was shedding the skin of the man Catherine had loved to become the monster she had saved him from. And he was doing it to save her daughter. They made camp in a cluster of jagged rocks that offered a commanding view of the entrance to Devil's Canyon. From here, they could watch the trail without being seen. As dawn broke, they saw him, a lone sentry positioned high on a ledge, his rifle glinting in the early morning sun. "He's careless," Silas whispered, his eyes narrowed, too confident. "He thinks I'm coming alone up the main trail," Owen reasoned. "This is a test, to see if I followed instructions." The plan was simple and brutal. Tobias would create a diversion to the east, a small rock slide to draw the sentry's attention. While the man was distracted, Owen and Silas would circle around and take him from behind. The execution was flawless. The clatter of falling rocks echoed through the canyon, and the sentry swiveled his rifle, pointed toward the sound. In that moment of distraction, Owen and Silas moved. They were shadows, silent and swift. Before the sentry could turn back, Owen was on him. There was a brief struggle, a muffled grunt, and the man was disarmed and bound a gag, silencing his curses. They dragged him back to their hiding place. He was young, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and bravado. Owen knelt before him, his massive frame blocking out the sky. "Where is my daughter?" Owen's voice was unnervingly calm. The young outlaw spat at his feet. "Go to hell, Blackthorn." Owen didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply met the man's gaze, and in his eyes, the outlaw saw something that made his bravado crumble. He saw the cold, empty promise of a death far worse than a quick bullet. "Cain won't be able to protect you from me," Owen said softly. "You have one chance to live through this day. Where is she?" The young man's resolve broke. "The old stamp mill, 3 miles up the canyon. She's fine. He told us not to harm her." Why Silas pressed. "What's so special about this job?" The outlaw hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. "It ain't about the money. Cain, he hates him." He nodded toward Owen. "Says it's personal, about family." Before he could say more, a sharp crack echoed from the far side of the canyon. The sentry's head snapped back, a small dark hole appearing in his forehead. He slumped to the ground dead before he hit the dirt. Owen and Silas dove for cover, dragging the body with them. A sniper. Cain had a man watching his own sentry, an insurance policy against betrayal. The shot was a message Cain was in control. He saw everything. But the sentry's last word hung in the air, a revelation that changed the entire equation. Family. This wasn't about a cattle war. It wasn't about a professional rivalry. Viper Cain, the ruthless killer, had a personal familial reason to hate Owen Blackthorn. The gentleman's hands, the expensive cigars, the judge from Colorado. It all started to coalesce into a terrifying but still incomplete picture. Cain wasn't just a ghost from his past. He was tied to Catherine. The knowledge was a punch to the gut. Owen now understood that he wasn't just fighting an old enemy. He was fighting a brother, a cousin, someone connected to the woman he had loved and lost. This quest was no longer just about rescuing his daughter. It was about uncovering a truth that had been buried for 12 years, a truth that Viper Cain was now using as a weapon. And Owen knew with a chilling certainty that the final confrontation would not be about ransom or revenge, but about the very definition of family. The next blow was not a bullet, but paper and ink. As Owen Tobias and Silas prepared their assault on the stamp mill, Deputy Pete found them again, his horse lathered and his face pale with alarm. He carried a stack of freshly printed posters. "Owen, they're everywhere," he stammered, handing one over. "Nailed up in every town from here to the territorial line." Owen stared at the poster, his blood running cold. It was a crude but recognizable sketch of his younger self, the man known as the Phantom. Above it, in bold letters, "Wanted dead or alive." Below the reward, 5,000 av Arlersen for the murder of the Honorable Judge William Hayes and other crimes. It was a lie. He had never met Judge William Hayes. But the description was perfect down to the scar on his left hand. The posters were Cain's masterstroke, supplied no doubt by his powerful ally, Judge Hayes of Colorado, the very man claiming to want him captured. Cain wasn't just revealing Owen's past. He was rewriting it, painting him as a cold-blooded killer of a respected judge. He was turning every lawman, every bounty hunter, every citizen in the territory against him. He was isolating him completely. The judge, "It's a frame-up," Owen said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He was no longer a desperate father. In the eyes of the law, he was a wanted fugitive. "Sheriff Murdoch told me to tell you he doesn't believe a word of it." Pete said, his loyalty shining in his young eyes. "He's facing pressure from the territorial marshal to lead a posse after you. But he's holding them off. He's putting his career on the line for you, Owen." The weight of that trust was immense. Murdoch, a man sworn to uphold the law, was choosing to believe in the man he knew over the evidence being manufactured by a corrupt judge. They had to move, and they had to move now. The posters had accelerated Kane's timeline. Soon a federal posse would be descending on this canyon, and they wouldn't distinguish between Kane's outlaws and the man on the poster. The storm broke as they reached the ridge overlooking the old stamp mill. It was a deluge, turning the dry earth to thick red mud. Lightning tore across the sky, momentarily illuminating their target, a cluster of dilapidated buildings hunkered down in the canyon, a single light glowing in the largest structure. Thunder rolled like artillery, a perfect cover for their approach. The stakes had been raised to an impossible height. Owen was now fighting on three fronts against Kane and his gang, against the law that was hunting him, and against the raging storm that threatened to swallow them all. He was utterly alone, an outlaw in the eyes of the world, with only two loyal friends and the ghost of a dead lawman on his side. This was Kane's endgame. He had stripped Owen of his name, his reputation, and his allies, leaving him with nothing but the violent skills he had tried so hard to forget. The trap was set. Now all that was left was for the Phantom to walk into it. The stamp mill was a fortress of rotting timber and rusting iron, crouched in the canyon like a dying beast. Under the relentless assault of the thunderstorm, Owen moved. The thunder masked his footsteps, and the torrential rain washed his tracks away as soon as they were made. Tobias had gone east, tasked with creating a diversion, a fire in an old supply shed that would draw the bulk of the guards away from the main building. Owen, stripped to his shirt, the cold rain plastering it to his skin, moved toward the mill. He carried no rifle, only the Colt Peacemaker on his hip and a length of rope. His mission was not to kill, but to neutralize. He would not become the murderer on the wanted posters. He found the first guard huddled under a leaky awning, trying to keep his cigarette lit. A shadow among shadows, Owen closed the distance. A hand clamped over the man's mouth, an arm locked around his throat in a hold that restricted blood flow, not air. The man struggled for a few seconds, then went limp, unconscious. Owen bound him securely and left him in the darkness. Two more guards fell just as silently. They were professionals, but they were watching for a frontal assault, not a ghost who used the storm as his cloak. As he worked, he could see the orange glow of Tobias's fire to the east, followed by shouts and the sound of men running toward the blaze. The diversion was working. He reached the main building, a sprawling structure that housed the ore-crushing machinery. The single lantern glowed from a window in what must have been the foreman's office. He pressed his ear to the rough-hewn planks. He could hear two voices, Kane's and Bethany's. He slipped inside through a collapsed section of the wall, moving through the cavernous dark space filled with the hulking shapes of silent machinery. The smell of rust and damp earth filled his nostrils. He crept toward the light, his heart a cold, steady drum against his ribs. He peered through a crack in the office door. Kane, or James, as he now suspected, stood with his back to him, facing Bethany, who was tied to a chair. "Your father was a monster, little one," James was saying, his voice laced with a cold, poetic cruelty. "He took my sister, your mother, away from a life of comfort and safety, and brought her to this wasteland to die. You're wrong." Bethany's voice was small, but defiant, filled with a strength that made Owen's chest ache with pride. "Papa loved her. He built a life for her." "He built her a grave." James roared, his control finally snapping. He raised a hand as if to strike her. In that instant, Owen moved. The door crashed open. James spun around, his eyes wide with surprise, reaching for the gun on his hip. But Owen was already across the room. He did not draw his own weapon. He was Owen Blackthorne, the father, not the Phantom, the killer. The confrontation was short and brutal. Owen's rage was a controlled, focused thing. He deflected James's arm and the gunshot going wild, shattering the lantern and plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the strobing flashes of lightning from the window. He disarmed his brother-in-law with a single sharp twist of the wrist. He slammed James against the wall, his forearm pressed against his throat. "This ends now." Owen growled, his face inches from Kane's. "You think this is the end?" James gasped, a wild, triumphant light in his eyes. "This is only the beginning. When they find your body, you'll be the phantom, the wanted murderer. And I will be the hero who brought you to justice. I'll take my niece back to civilization, back to her rightful place." A flash of lightning illuminated his face, contorted in a mask of righteous fury. It's what he wants. It's what he planned all along. Who? Owen demanded, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrifying clarity. "My father, your judge, jury, and executioner, James," laughed a ragged, broken sound. "Judge Hayes didn't just want you dead, Blackthorne. He wanted you erased. He orchestrated everything. The wanted posters, the telegram to the sheriff, all of it. He turned me into his weapon, a son avenging his murdered father, all to reclaim the granddaughter he believes you stole from him." The revelation struck Owen with the force of a physical blow. James wasn't the mastermind. He was a pawn, a man consumed by a grief that had been carefully cultivated and manipulated by his own father. He was as much a victim as Owen was. Bethany's uncle. Family. Owen's rage subsided, replaced by a profound, aching pity. He looked at the man pinned against the wall, not a monster, but a broken man twisted by lies and a father's cruel ambition. He slowly released the pressure on James's throat. He stepped back, lowering his hands. In the dim light, he was no longer a threat, but a man making a choice. He would not kill his wife's brother. He would not become the man Judge Hayes had painted him to be. "It's over," James Owen said, his voice heavy with the weight of 12 years of pain. "Your father's lies die tonight." He turned and knelt before Bethany, his large hands gently untying the ropes that bound her. "It's okay, little bird. Papa's here." Bethany flung her arms around his neck, burying her face in his chest, her small body trembling with released fear. At that moment, the door creaked open, and Sheriff Murdoch appeared, his rifle ready. He took in the scene. James slumped against the wall, broken and defeated. Owen holding his daughter, the protector, not the aggressor. The law had arrived, but the justice had already been decided. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the air clean and cold. In the aftermath, as Sheriff Murdoch took a subdued James Hayes into custody, the truth unspooled. James, broken by the revelation of his father's manipulation, agreed to confess everything. He would testify against the man who had turned a son's grief into a weapon for a twisted family vendetta. As they prepared to leave the stamp mill, James stopped before Bethany. His face was a ruin of shame and sorrow. From his coat pocket he pulled a small oval-shaped photograph, protected by a tarnished silver frame. He pressed it into her hand. "This was your mother," he said, his voice thick. "When she was about your age, I wanted you to have it. So you could see. She was happy then too." Bethany looked at the photo of the young girl with mischievous green eyes and auburn curls so much like her own. She looked up at her uncle, and in her gaze there was no fear, and only a child's profound and simple capacity for forgiveness. A quiet moment of reconciliation passed between them, a fragile bridge built over a canyon of lies and pain. Months later, autumn had given way to the quiet hush of early winter. Judge Harold Hayes had been arrested, his reputation destroyed, his conspiracy exposed by his own son's testimony. James was serving a reduced sentence in a territorial prison, his regular letters to Owen and Bethany filled with remorse and a burgeoning hope for a future he was determined to earn. One quiet morning, Owen and Bethany walked to the small windswept hill where Catherine was buried. The simple wooden headstone stood against a vast blue sky. Owen knelt the cold earth seeping through the knees of his trousers. From his pocket he took the silver locket with the compass rose engraving now polished and gleaming. He didn't put it around his neck, nor did he give it to Bethany. Instead, he gently hung it over the corner of the headstone. It was a symbolic act, a quiet release. He was no longer just the guardian of her memory haunted by the past. He was the builder of their daughter's future, a future free from the shadows that had chased them for so long. He had triumphed not by resurrecting the phantom, but by choosing in the final critical moment to remain Owen Blackthorne a father. Bethany stood beside him clutching the small photograph of her young mother. She had not lost a father in the storm. She had gained the missing half of her family's story. Together, they had faced the ghosts of the past and found not vengeance, but healing. The peace Owen had sought for so long was no longer a fortress to be defended, but a quiet, open field where a father and daughter could stand together, looking toward the horizon, their true north finally clear.